Earlier today, Congressman Chip Roy introduced legislation to repeal the Freedom of Access to Clinic Entrances, or FACE Act. Now, this legislation, which dates back to Bill Clinton, this has been used by the U.S. Attorney General Merrick Garland and the Department of Justice to ramp up their targeting of pro-life activists for arrest and prison time since the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade last year. In fact, we've had over 24 pro-lifers have been arrested using the FACE Act. Now, Republicans in Congress are bringing in Attorney General Garland to testify before the House Judiciary Committee tomorrow. And former President Donald Trump told attendees at the Pray Vote Stand Summit last Friday that if elected, pardoning pro-life activists and other political prisoners would be a priority his first day in office as president. Joining me now to discuss this is Chris Gacek, Senior Fellow for Regulatory Affairs at the Family Research Council. Chris, welcome back to Washington Watch.
It's good to be here.
All right, let's start with the FACE Act. This was used a few times, but not much. It was a big club that Bill Clinton gave to the pro-abortion community back in the 90s. But it has been used with great enthusiasm by the Biden DOJ to round up pro-lifers and put them in jail.
You know, I was just going back and looking over the language of the FACE Act, and also recollecting a conversation I had with somebody at the Pray Vote Stand Summit who was who participated in Operation Rescue protests, and the FACE Act was used to shut down that form of protest. But one of the things, it's very broad, right? In other words, there were also threats, maybe threats of violence and attacks with acid on church, vandalism, things like that. But those sorts of attacks, I think that the statute has never been challenged for the sorts of things which basically amount to like minor trespassing, where people are sort of sitting, in a location like the civil rights protesters were at, Woolworth lunch counters, right?
Right.
I mean, would it have been great if they had been able to have been put in prison by the state of Alabama for 15 years or something? I mean, and I think that's what sort of is going on, this sort of abuse of this statute for really minor, almost misdemeanor offenses, right?
It wasn't used very much for almost 20 years. And of course, after the overturn of Roe, they've all of a sudden decided they're going to go after pro-lifers. So Congress introducing a measure to repeal that. Any idea what the prospects are of its repeal?
Well, let me just say, a process like this is a long one, right? And what I mean by that is, thank goodness Chip Roy did this, because this is the first time we've had a conversation on this. And now we can go back and start to look at, what was really going on in, 1994. And what was the statute? Was the statute too broad? And I think it was far too broad. And then you can start to marshal your support, for these positions. And because, if you're talking about firebombing or, shooting people, all of those things are felonies under state laws anyway.
This has been used for people just defending themselves, pushing. There was a pushing and a shoving match in one case where the pro-lifer was then arrested and jailed. Of course, it was eventually thrown out, but that's very costly.
Right.
So, but this, of course, I have no doubt it'll pass the House, won't go anywhere in the Senate. Even if it were, President Biden's not going to sign it. So this is something that's going to have to wait for a Republican administration, which leads me to my next point. At the Pray Vote Stand Summit this past Friday night, when former President Donald Trump spoke, he announced that the moment he wins the election, he will appoint a special task force to rapidly review the cases of every political prisoner who has been unjustly persecuted by the Biden administration, end quote. What's that look like?
Well, in the context that we were just speaking about, I think it is going to refer to these FACE Act prisoners. And I think it's one of the things that's going on here is even if somebody was guilty of a misdemeanor and they deserve to be convicted of some minor local misdemeanor, and put in jail for a day or something, or 2 days. 15 years. When you're involved in a situation like that, the whole structure of things is so unjust. And it just made me, listening to former President Trump, is I realized, how fantastically brilliant the founders were, because you can have parts of the government and prosecutors who are completely out of control, but this presidential pardon, the power to do that, is a real check and balance on it that I don't think we've ever seen in the United States before. And it may be that we're going to have to start using this in widespread manner, not just with regard to all these sorts of really aggressive, out of bounds prosecutions that we're seeing, whether it's on pro-life issues, the FACE Act, or some of the January 6 people, or other kinds of political crimes that the Biden administration is finding in various areas. Gun dealers and people like this who are being rolled up with ridiculous regulatory crimes, farmers, and these kinds of things. So I think that it's time, for our side to really start thinking about this deeply and start using this weapon.
This special task force, could this be a standing task force to go through and review these types of cases where we have political prisoners in our own country?
Well, I think so, and it sounds completely crazy, but let's say we're dealing with Canada, right, which has become basically an authoritarian police state, and they're putting all these truckers and people like this, and
well, but you said
we're
almost out of time, Chris. But you mentioned January 6th. We still have hundreds of people in prison, in jail from January the 6th that they've not had their trials.
Right. There are 500. I mean, it's hundreds and hundreds, right? And exactly. This
is long overdue. And I think this is something that conservatives are going to be looking at, because there's no question. And I'm a law and order guy, all right? I'm not for the civil disobedience as a former police officer. But the law must be applied evenly and justly. And there's no question in my mind that's not happening under the Biden administration. Chris Gacek, thanks so much for joining us.
You're welcome.